welcome to my video tutorial on asynchronous functions with GameMaker Studio and HTML5. If you're watching this video, you should have already downloaded and set up my Async 0.6 example and have it running correctly on your server. Now if you've got all that set up and running correctly, you're probably wondering, how can I adapt this using my game? That's what we're going to talk about today with this tutorial. We're going to build a game from scratch, and I'm going to show you how to integrate that PHP script into your custom game. In this video, we're going to be using Async version 0.6. If you're using a new version to follow along from version 0.7 on, the Async PHP script is referred to as GameSync. So just simply transpose those numbers and you'll be okay to follow along. We're going to use one single function in this video that's available in both scripts, so it's okay if you're using a newer version. Just remember the script name difference. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a table to hold our information in. And if you're following along after the quick start guide, then you should have the GameMaker database already created. If you don't have the GameMaker database, or if you want to use a different database, that's okay. It doesn't matter what database you use as long as you have permission to create a table inside of it. So we're going to create a new table to store three values from our game. We're going to store a score variable, the X position of the player, and the Y position of the player. These are three easy variables that are easy to get from inside the game without going through a lot of extra complicated functions. So I think they'll be easy to follow along with. So I'm going to create a new table and I'm going to name it Game 1. And we're going to create 4 columns on this table. Now we're going to store 3 variables, but we're going to use 4 columns. And the reason for this is you always want to have one row in your table that's unique. So we're going to create a unique row in the first column of the table. And I always name this something along the lines of ID. This row can be used later if you need to update or delete this table to make sure that you're pointing directly at the correct table. So I'm going to name this table P_ID, which stands for player ID. This is going to be stored as an integer, so I'm going to leave it as such. The next one we're going to create is P_score to store the player's score, P_x, and P_y. These are all going to be stored as integers, so we're just going to leave the type set as integer. Now if we scroll over, you're going to see several more options, but the only two that interest us are these two right here. For the very first row that you named ID or something similar, you want to check the auto increment box and you want to set this to primary. This will make it the primary key on your database table, and that way it will always be unique and you can use it to call upon specific information in a specific row at a later date. Now that we're done there, we're going to save this, and now you can see that we have a new table in our database named Game 1. Now that we're done there, we're going to jump over to GameMaker Studio, or you can use GameMaker HTML5, whichever one you have at your disposal. First thing you want to check is that we're set to export to HTML5. We're going to create a sprite, and I'm going to name the sprite SPR Player. And we're going to make a new sprite. We're not looking to win any graphic awards with this example, so we're just going to go with a simple circle. And the next thing we're going to do is create an object, and we're going to name this OBJPlayer. And we're going to assign it the sprite that we just created. The first thing we're going to add to our new object is a create event, and inside our create event we're going to add one single line of code: global.pscore equals 0. Now I realize that GameMaker has a built-in scoring function with the built-in score variable, but we want to show how it works with global variables as well, so I'm going to use my own created variable to store the score for this example. And we're going to close that. The next thing we're going to do is create 4 keyboard events for the left, up, and down, so that we can store the player's movement. so you don't have to watch me do this, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead. Okay, now that we've created our 4 keyboard events, I'll show you just real quick. Basically all I did was put a very simple movement code for all 4 events. I basically put a variation of this, x minus equals 5. So when you press left, it will move you left, and when you move up, it's going to move you y minus equals 5 to move you up. And of course, right and down are the same thing, they're just plus instead of minus. Now when I prototype or build examples, I like to show my variables on the screen so I can see what's going on. Sometimes this is a little bit easier than debugging depending on the situation. So we're going to draw some variables in the draw event. The first thing you need to add is the draw self function. Otherwise you will see the variables drawn on the screen, but you will no longer see your sprite drawn on the screen. The next thing I'm going to do is add 3 draw text lines to draw the 3 variables we're going to store: the player's score, the player's X location, and the player Y location. And again, so you don't have to watch me do this, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead. Okay, and as you can see, I've created 3 lines here. Basically, we're going to draw the text, score, and the variable global P score on the screen. Then we're going to draw the text player X along with the player's X location on the screen and the player Y with the Y location on the screen. Once you've done that, you can close this box, and at this point we'll give it a test run to make sure everything's working as expected. So we're going to create a room, and we're going to throw our player object in there. And if everything's working correctly, you should see your 3 variables drawn in the corner of the screen up there, and you should be able to move your little guy around with the arrow keys. Okay, now that we're on track, we'll close that. And we're going to add in the line of code that will allow us to communicate with our PHP script. Now, for a simple example like this, we could do that inside the player object, but we're going to create a new object. So first we need a sprite for that object, and we're going to name this SPR save for a save button. We're going to create a new sprite, and we're going to make this sprite just a randomly colored square. And we're just going to draw an S on it for save. Something simple. And then we're going to create an object, and we're going to name this object obj save. And we're going to assign it the sprite we just created. The save button is going to be initiated by a left mouse click. So you're going to add a mouse event and use a left release mouse event. If you use a regular mouse event, then you'll fire this off like 5 to 10 times every time you press it, and we don't want that to happen. So we're going to do left release, and we're going to add in a piece of code, and we're going to add in the HTTP GET function. This is a pretty simple function. It's pretty straightforward. You're going to type HTTP GET, and then inside that you're going to add in the string that is a URL to your PHP script. In this example, we're going to be putting the async PHP script right next to the index.html file that the game creates. So we can simply just put async.php. In a production environment, it would be better if the script is stored somewhere else on your server, and in that case you would put a direct path to the script. The next thing we're going to do is add a question mark, and this tells PHP to expect some parameters. The first parameter we're going to use is the NA parameter, which in 0.6 stands for new account. If you're using anything above 0.6, you will have a different function you can use called IA, which stands for insert data. I had not added that function in yet on the 0.6 version, but the new account function does the exact same thing, so that's the one we're going to use. You should have f equals NA, just like you see here. And then you're going to add an ampersand to add in another function. The next parameters we're going to pass are going to be our game's built-in variables that we want to store in our database. Now we can name these anything we want as we pass them along, as long as we keep the variable names intact. So just for fun, we're going to name these something that have nothing to do with our script. And for score, we're going to pass it along named as Dave. And at the end, we're going to be adding in our variables, so you're going to have to go in and out of the string function here, which just can be done just as we see here. And then we're going to add a plus, and we're going to have to jump back into the string to add the other ampersand. And for the x variable, we're going to pass that as x-ray equals, and then jump back out to add in our x variable. And then one more time so that we can include our y variable, we're going to jump back into the string, add in an ampersand, and we're going to call our y variable yo-yo. And when you're all done, you should have a string that looks very similar to this. And you can, as I said, you can name these anything you want. So you can name this score, X, Y, it doesn't matter. I'm just naming them something different to kind of show you what does and does not have to be the same. The only one that matters in this line is the f equals NA. This is the one that will execute the function in your PHP script, and the NA is going to tell it what function to execute. If we jump over to our PHP script, we can see here that on line 27 we have f equals getF. Well, this will be getting the URL parameter of f and assigning it to a variable named f. So this is very, very important that you have it correct. In this instance, we're passing along the parameter NA, which stands for new account. So basically what's going to happen is it's going to get the value of f, assign it to a variable named f, and at the bottom of the script it's going to run f through a switch statement to determine what the value of that parameter was and what function it should execute next. Since we're passing it across NA, it's going to execute the new account function, or create account function. Now that we're done with that, we're going to close this and close this. We're going to put the save button in the room, somewhere where you can play or can find it, and we're going to close that. And then we would normally create the application, which you can do if you're using GameMaker HTML5, but as you can see, I'm using the GameMaker Studio beta, and the create application function is not available. So what I'm actually going to have to do is do a test run of my game so that it updates the files that are in my temporary directory. Then I'm going to browse to my temporary directory. As you can see, the HTML5 game is there. Then I'm going to open my FTP client and connect to my server. I'm going to create a new directory to store this in, and I'm going to name the directory example. And from there, I'm going to upload my HTML5 game. Now that that is uploaded, we're going to make the necessary changes to the async PHP script. The first thing you're going to need to edit in your script up here at the top is to fill in your connection details. You may have already done this if you followed along with the quick setup guide. The one thing you will have to change is your table. You're going to have to change this to connect to the new table you created. So we're going to change this to say game 1. Lines 20 through 22 are your database connection details. We don't have to worry about that. Lines 27 through 33, these are the variables that are going to get passed from your game to the PHP script. So as we've discussed, this one here is always going to remain. The rest, these all pertain to the last example, so they can all go. We are going to leave one behind, and we're just going to edit this just simply so that we can remember how it should look. When you're creating these variables, the first part here, pname, you can again name this anything you want. This is a variable that's going to be defined and used inside this script, so it doesn't really matter what you call it. We're going to call it pscore for simplicity. Now in our game, we pass the score variable along as Dave. So that is what this is going to have to be, because it's getting the value of Dave and assigning it to the variable pscore. So for simplicity's sake, we're going to just copy this, and we're going to paste it 2 more times to create our next 2 variables. And we're going to call this one px for player X, and that one was passed along as X-ray. And then we're going to call this one py for player Y, and that variable was passed along as yo-yo. So basically right here you would list every potential variable that your game might pass, whether you're going to use it for the current function or not. That way they're already in here, ready to go, and later they'll all be set up and ready for use. And we're not going to use any encryption here, so lines 32 and 34 don't really matter. But we do need to edit our create account function, which is the function we're going to be using for this tutorial. Now, as I said, in newer versions of the script, there's actually a insert data function, so you would use that instead. But in this example, we're going to use the create account function because it does the exact same thing. The first thing you need to look at is here. We have the name, function, create account. What's in between the parentheses are the variables that that function needs to do its job. In this case, you see we have 4 variables here. The first one is the connection details. That one would have to remain because that's the connection to your database. The next one is MySQL table. That one also should remain because that is the name of your table, so it knows which table it's inserting into. The ones we do need to get rid of are going to be these 2 right here. And we need to add in the new variables we just created up top. So we're going to add pscore, px, and py, just like so. Then on the next line, line 40, we're going to have to modify the insert here. As you can see, the query is built to insert into MySQL table. This is this here, what is specified above. Player name, password, PIP, PNP, POP, PSP. These would be all the affected rows. So we need to change this to match the affected rows in our current database. So referring back to our game 1 table, we have pscore, px, and py. These are going to be affected rows, so we need to list those in the same order. So we're going to change this to pscore, px, and py, and then once again we're going to delete the rest of these because they are no longer rows in our database. And then we're going to insert the values of the variables above. So we're going to list here, we're going to list the variables that we created above. So our variables are pscore, px, and py. So you should have something that looks similar to this. The one last edit we're going to have to make is down below at the very bottom in the switch statement. When we call a function, we need to pass along the value of the variable we're going to be calling. So once again, on new account, we need to add in the variables that will be passed along. So one more time, it's going to be pscore, px, and py. With all that set up, we should be ready to go for a test run. So we're going to save our async PHP. And we're going to upload that to our web host. It should go directly next to the indexed HTML file if you set it up similar to I did, to where you're just simply calling the async PHP and not calling a direct URL. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to open our web browser and we're going to run a test. If you uploaded your game correctly, you should see it load, just as we see here. I'm going to move our guy around a little bit, and we can see the player X and the player Y, 114 and 383, and we're going to hit the save button. If everything worked correctly, you should be able to come over here, refresh your browser, and see that those values are in fact inserted in the database. The score is 0, the X is 114, and the Y is 383. If we move our guy around again to get some different values, we have player X is 459 and the player Y is 33, and we're going to hit the save button again, and we're going to refresh our view again to see that that too was inserted into our database. As you can see here, the ID is auto incrementing to give it a unique ID number, which is exactly what we want. So for one last final step here, we're going to give our little guy something to up his score. So coming back to your GameMaker file, we're going to create a new sprite. We're going to name this SPR point. And again, we're just going to make this something simple. We're going to make a green rounded circle thing here. And we're going to put a P on it for point. And then we're going to create an object, and we're going to name it obj point. And we're going to assign it this sprite we just created. Jump back over to the player object, and we're going to add a collision event with obj point. And we're going to add one simple line of code in here. Global dot pscore plus equals 100. So we're going to give our guy 100 points for collecting this little circle here. And we're going to pepper a few of those little circles around the room. After doing this, again, you would need to export your application, but I can't, so I'm going to run it like I did before. And when the game is up and running, I'm going to transfer all these files to my web host. Switching back to the game tab, I'm going to hit a refresh to reload the game. We see our little points, and we can see that hitting those increases our score. Now typically you would want to destroy these, so you would also add a destruction event. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to be able to continually up the score so we could see the progress. So as long as you're touching one of those guys, you're going to up your score. So again, we're going to hit the save button, flip back over here and refresh our view, and you can see that also the score is being saved in your database. So with all that set up and ready to go, you're ready to do some simple inserts into your PHP MySQL database. I hope you were able to follow along with this tutorial and understand everything I talked about today. Come back for our next video where I'll show you how to pull this data back out of the database and load it back into your sample game. This is Chris, and I wish you luck on all of your future games.